There was a man who 20 years ago gave up his seat to elderly passengers on the bus every single day. He used to cry while watching news reports about children suffering in flood zones. He once lost sleep over a harsh sentence he accidentally said to his wife. And yet today, that same man sits calmly signing layoff orders for hundreds of workers just days before the Lunar New Year, then walks out of the meeting room with the relaxed smile of someone who just finished an ordinary phone call. What happened to him? He did not suddenly become a bad person overnight. There was never a moment when he consciously decided, from now on, I will live without a conscience. It happened slowly, quietly, so subtly that even he failed to notice it. Day after day, a small piece of who he once was disappeared without a sound. And the most disturbing part is not his story. The most disturbing part is that you and I, all of us, may already be standing at the beginning of the very same path. We just do not realize how far we have already walked. Today, we are going to confront the 7 stages of human moral decline and how ordinary people slowly lose themselves without even realizing it. Stage 1. Complacency. No one begins to lose themselves through one dramatic decision. It always starts with something small, comfortable, and seemingly harmless. The feeling that everything is finally okay. Imagine a man who has just been promoted. He worked hard for years, sacrificed a great deal, and now he is finally being rewarded. Life becomes easier. His income improves. People start looking at him differently, and somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice begins to whisper, "I've made it. I deserve to relax now." This is the most dangerous moment, even though it looks completely innocent. When people feel they have achieved something meaningful, the brain naturally lowers its guard. Psychologists call this the moral licensing effect. It means that after doing something good, or after feeling like we are already a good person, we unconsciously give ourselves permission to loosen our own moral standards. Not because we are evil, but because the mind starts balancing its own internal moral ledger. The man who was just promoted begins ignoring small things he once would never have overlooked. One day, a coworker tries to talk about stress and burnout, but he is busy with meetings, so he simply nods and walks away. Another time, he notices something suspicious in a financial report, but tells himself he probably misunderstood it and lets it go. Then one evening, his wife says she wants to talk about a problem in the family, but he is exhausted and says, "Maybe another day." That another day never comes. And each time he ignores these moments, he does not feel like he is doing anything wrong. In fact, he barely feels anything at all. That is the true nature of complacency. It does not hurt. It does not create conflict. It quietly fills the empty spaces with a false sense of peace. Research from Northwestern University found that people who have recently experienced success are significantly more likely to make unethical decisions afterward. Not because they suddenly became different people, but because they begin spending the moral credit they unconsciously gave themselves. They believe they have already proven they are good enough, so this one compromise no longer feels important. And complacency is not limited to successful people. It also happens to anyone who stays inside their comfort zone for too long. When life stops challenging us, when nothing forces us to reflect on who we are becoming, the voice of conscience grows quieter and quieter. Not because it disappears, but because we become used to living without listening to it. And so, the first stage of human corruption arrives without explosions, without chaos, without warning. It is simply an ordinary afternoon when someone sits down, exhales in relief, and thinks, everything is fine. But that is exactly the moment when things quietly stop being fine. Stage 2. Justification. If complacency is the stage where we slowly fall asleep to ourselves, then justification is the moment we begin lying to ourselves without realizing we are lying. Let's return to the man who was promoted in the previous stage. He has already grown used to ignoring small things. But one day, something happens that is no longer small. His boss gives him a task: remove a longtime employee from an important project, not because the employee did anything wrong, but because the company wants to replace him with someone politically connected. He knows it is unfair. He feels a sharp discomfort deep inside his chest. But instead of listening to that feeling, his mind starts moving in another direction. If I don't do it, someone else will. I have a family to take care of. I can't afford to take risks. He's still young. Being unemployed for a while won't destroy him. This is the company's decision, not mine. These thoughts sound reasonable. They are not entirely false. And that is exactly what makes them so dangerous. Neuroscientists call this process motivated reasoning. When people want to do something because it benefits them, the brain automatically searches for arguments that justify the decision instead of searching for the truth. In other words, we do not think in order to discover what is right. We think in order to defend the answer we already wanted from the beginning. Professor Dan Ariely of Duke University, who spent decades studying dishonesty and human behavior, wrote that most people do not see themselves as bad people, even when they are doing harmful things. They always carry a story in their minds explaining why their actions are reasonable, necessary, or even helpful to others. This is not usually intentional deception. It is the ego's defense mechanism, something the human brain has developed over thousands of years of evolution. What is even more concerning is that every time we successfully justify an action, our conscience becomes slightly more tolerant. The next time, we need fewer excuses to convince ourselves. Then the time after that, we barely need to think about it at all. Slowly, justification stops being an inner struggle and becomes an automatic reflex. The man in our story signs the document removing his colleague from the project. He goes home, eats dinner normally, and sleeps peacefully. In his mind, the story he tells himself feels logical and convincing. He does not see himself as guilty. He sees himself as realistic, mature, and practical. And that is the clearest sign that the stage of justification has completed its work. When we can do something wrong and still sleep well at night, not because we no longer care, but because we have built a story persuasive enough to silence the truth. Conscience does not disappear. Its voice simply gets drowned out. Stage 3, gradual desensitization. There is a famous experiment that many people have heard before, but few truly reflect on its meaning. If you throw a frog into boiling water, it will immediately jump out. But if you place it in cold water and slowly raise the temperature, it will remain there until it no longer has the strength to escape. Not because the frog is stupid, but because the change happens too gradually for its brain to recognize the danger. Humans are no different. After enough complacency and enough self-justification, something strange begins to happen. The things that once made us uncomfortable suddenly stop affecting us, not because we consciously accepted them, but because we have been exposed to them so many times that our nervous system no longer reacts. Psychologists call this phenomenon ethical fading. When a behavior is repeated often enough, its moral dimension slowly disappears from our awareness. What was once a serious ethical choice starts to feel like just another routine task. The man in our story has now signed several unfair decisions. He has ignored wrongdoing multiple times. He has silenced his conscience often enough that it barely speaks anymore. And now he enters a stage where he no longer needs excuses, because he no longer feels the need to justify anything at all. He assigns unfair work to his subordinates without hesitation. He sits in meetings listening to executives discuss how to push financial pressure onto smaller partners, and he nods along as casually as if he were listening to a weather report. The small emotional reactions that once stirred inside his chest no longer activate. The human brain is designed to conserve energy. Anything repeated often enough eventually shifts from conscious decision-making into automatic habit. That is why the first time we drive a car, we must focus intensely. But after years of driving, we can do it while thinking about something completely different. This mechanism is incredibly useful in daily life, but when it applies to harmful behavior, the result is dangerous. Actions that should force us to stop and reflect become things we perform almost automatically. Dr. Anne Tenbrunsel of the University of Notre Dame, a leading researcher on ethical fading, explains that this stage is especially dangerous because it has no obvious warning signs. People experiencing it do not feel like they are changing. They simply feel more practical, more experienced, more realistic about how the world works. That is why so many people, when looking back on this period of their lives, cannot pinpoint the exact moment they changed, because there was never a clear line dividing who they were from who they became. The stage of gradual desensitization is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is simply the quiet passage of ordinary days while somewhere deep inside, an important part of a person slowly falls asleep and never fully wakes up again. Stage 4. The loss of empathy. There is a region in the human brain called the anterior insular cortex. This area becomes active when we see someone else in pain, when we hear another person crying, or when we witness injustice happening to a stranger. Neuroscientists describe it as one of the biological foundations of empathy. It is the reason we feel a sharp ache inside when we see a child fall down, even if that child means nothing to us personally. But this part of the brain can slowly be turned off. After passing through complacency, justification, and gradual desensitization, the man in our story enters a stage where he still sees other people suffering, still hears their complaints, still understands that someone is hurting because of his decisions. But the information no longer reaches him emotionally. It creates no real response. It is like a bell ringing inside a room where the person has been wearing headphones for years. This does not happen overnight. Researchers at the University of Zurich studied people who regularly made decisions that negatively affected others in organizational environments. Over time, they discovered a clear decline in emotional response to the consequences of those decisions. Not because these individuals were born cold-hearted, but because the brain gradually learned to disconnect actions from emotional consequences as a defense mechanism against constant discomfort. In simpler terms, when we repeatedly hurt other people while trying to avoid feeling guilty, the brain slowly learns how to stop making us feel guilty at all. It becomes an internal compromise we never consciously signed, but still end up paying for. The man now listens to employees explain how their families are struggling financially, and he simply stares at the report on the table. Not because he is intentionally cruel, but because he genuinely feels nothing. The distance between him and the suffering of the person in front of him has grown too wide for emotion to bridge anymore. This is what separates this stage from the earlier ones. Before, he still felt that something was wrong and then tried to justify it afterward. Now he no longer needs justification because there is nothing left inside him that demands one. Conscience depends on emotion as its fuel. And when empathy dries up, conscience loses the very thing that keeps it alive. The saddest part of this stage is that people living inside it usually do not realize what they have lost. They do not feel the absence because the thing that disappeared was their ability to feel that absence in the first place. They simply believe they have become practical, efficient, and emotionally strong. But what they call normal actually has another name: emptiness. Stage 5. Manipulation. There is a very thin line that most people never realize they have crossed. It is the line between no longer caring about other people's feelings and beginning to use those feelings as tools. Once empathy has faded, an empty space appears inside a person. And what enters that space is not obvious cruelty, but something far more subtle: the ability to observe others purely through logic, without emotional interference, and therefore understand how to control them for personal gain. At this stage, the man in our story is no longer simply making cold decisions. He begins calculating intentionally. He knows which employee is desperate for money and therefore too afraid to speak up. He knows which coworker is vulnerable about their reputation and can be pressured through fear. He knows exactly how to speak to upper management to create a positive image of himself while quietly placing others at a disadvantage. All of these calculations happen naturally, quickly, and without leaving behind any emotional weight. Psychologist Robert Cialdini, author of the classic work on influence and persuasion, made an important distinction between ethical influence and manipulation. Ethical influence means sharing truthful information and honest reasoning to help others make better decisions for themselves. Manipulation happens when someone exploits psychological weaknesses, distorts information, or creates pressure in order to force others into decisions that primarily serve the manipulator's interests, regardless of the harm it may cause. From the outside, the line between the two is not always obvious, but the person doing it usually knows which side they are standing on. What makes this stage especially dangerous is that it is often hidden behind the appearance of professionalism and competence. Manipulators rarely look like villains. They appear as talented leaders, skilled negotiators, or people who are exceptionally good at reading others. And when manipulation is polished with the right language, it can look almost identical to leadership. In many environments, it is even rewarded. But there is one consequence no one escapes, no matter how intelligent or skilled they are. When we spend enough time viewing people as pieces on a chessboard, we eventually begin seeing all relationships that way, even the most personal ones. His wife becomes someone to manage rather than love. Friends become connections to maintain because they are still useful. Even warm family moments are quietly filtered through the lens of self-interest. How does this benefit me? This is the point where moral decay no longer harms only strangers. It begins eating away at the very relationships that were supposed to shelter the human soul. And once the home inside a person starts collapsing, the next stage arrives very quickly. Stage 6, the erosion of identity. Some evenings, the man sits alone and suddenly remembers an old image from his past. He sees himself in his early 20s, carefully writing handwritten letters to his parents back home, shaping every word neatly because he was afraid his handwriting would be too messy for them to read. The memory feels vivid and real, but the person inside that memory now feels like a complete stranger. This is the first sign of the 6th stage. Not shame, not guilt, just a strange, cold, distant feeling that the person he once was and the person he has become no longer seem like the same human being. Human identity is not fixed. Psychologists have long understood that the self is built from a collection of values, beliefs, and personal stories we tell ourselves about who we are. When those values are gradually replaced by behaviors that contradict them, and when this continues long enough, the brain begins rewriting the story of the self in order to reduce inner conflict. American psychologist Leon Festinger called this phenomenon cognitive dissonance. And the way the brain usually resolves that tension is not by changing behavior, but by changing self-perception to match the behavior instead. In other words, instead of looking back at his actions and thinking, "I was wrong," the man looks back at his younger self and thinks, "I was naive back then. I simply didn't understand how the world works." Values do not disappear in a single day. They are gradually reframed as childish idealism, dismissed as inexperience, or renamed as unrealistic dreams. And each time that happens, another small piece of the old self quietly falls away without a sound. One of the clearest signs of this stage appears in the way a person begins speaking. Their language becomes emotionally distant and detached when discussing morality or human relationships. Words like principles, kindness, and responsibility slowly get replaced by phrases such as being realistic, efficiency, or There was no other choice. Language changes because the inner story has changed, and the inner story changes because the main character inside it is no longer the same person. Professor Philip Zimbardo, creator of the famous Stanford prison experiment, spent decades studying how people change under certain systems and environments. His conclusion was unsettling. Identity is rarely destroyed from the outside. It is replaced from the inside, piece by piece, through the choices a person makes every day. The man still remembers his name. He still recognizes his own face in the mirror. But the eyes looking back at him no longer feel familiar. Somewhere deep inside, he knows the person staring back is not the person he once hoped to become. But he believes he has already gone too far to return. Or at least, that is what he tells himself. Stage 7. The loss of humanity. During the Nuremberg war crime trials after World War II, psychologists confronted a question that still has no fully satisfying answer today. How could ordinary people, people with families, children, and kind neighbors, commit horrific acts without trembling? Political philosopher Hannah Arendt, who closely observed those trials, summarized her conclusion with a now famous phrase, the banality of evil. She did not mean those people were monsters. She meant they had stopped thinking. This is the true nature of the final stage. Losing one's humanity does not mean becoming a monster in the dramatic sense. It means reaching a state where other people are no longer seen as fully human beings. They become functions, statistics, obstacles, assets, or variables in a system to manage. And once that happens, almost any harmful action can be carried out without triggering a moral response. Because morality only exists within human connection. When other people no longer feel human in our eyes, morality loses the very people it was meant to protect. Dr. Philip Zimbardo, in his research on ordinary evil and dehumanization, explained that the loss of humanity is often accompanied by the use of dehumanizing language. People begin referring to others through cold, collective labels or impersonal metaphors instead of recognizing them as individuals. It is no coincidence that throughout history, every genocide began with changes in language before changes in action. Language is often the first place where humanity is either preserved or stripped away. At this stage, the man in our story no longer remembers the names of the employees who work under him, even after years together. He refers to them only by job titles or departments. When he hears that one of them has become seriously ill, his first thought is not concern for the person, but who will replace the position. Not because he consciously wants to be cruel, but because the question of the human being behind the situation no longer naturally appears in his mind. The most tragic part of this stage is that people living inside it often do not suffer. In fact, they may be highly successful, widely respected, and completely satisfied with their lives. The emptiness inside them has existed for so long that it no longer feels like a wound. It feels like normality. But this is not where the story ends, because if it ended here, it would only be a story about collapse. And what modern psychology has repeatedly shown is that the human mind is not one-directional. At any point within these 7 stages, even the final one, awakening is still possible. Not easy, not quick, but possible. And it all begins with one thing: having the courage to look directly into the mirror and ask yourself who the person staring back at you has truly become.